Hi, everybody. I'm excited to talk about IFS to you, and with this focus on addictions, uh, which I, I'll talk about, and then if we have time, maybe do something experiential, and then I have about at least 20 minutes of video to try and show of an example toward the end. So that's what I have in mind. And I'm also, because I want to introduce the model to those of you who don't know it, curious about how many don't know very much about it. So we have a little poll. Uh, so just fill in the poll real quick. Okay, great. So most of you have some sense of it. So I'll try and do a condensed version. Yeah, so as Irma was reading, I I'm pretty old. I began this about 40 years ago, this journey, and I do have a PhD in family therapy, marital and family therapy. And I was one of those obnoxious family therapists who thought we'd found the Holy Grail and that people who were exploring the intrapsychic world were wasting their time because we could change all that by just reorganizing families. And did an outcome study to prove that and found that we couldn't do that. And it was actually an outcome study with bulimia, which is the client I'm going to show later in the video has that problem. And so as my clients didn't get better, I started asking why, and they started to teach this to me. And that was about, I think this next year it's going to be 40 years. And they started talking about what they called parts of them that were surrounding their symptoms and would say, for example, when something bad happened in their life, it would trigger this critic who would call them all kinds of brutal names. And then that would bring in a part that could make them feel totally worthless and alone and empty and young, like a child. And that part was so distressing to feel that the binge would come in to take them away from it. But then the act of the binge would bring back the critic, who's now calling him a pig on top of the other names. And that, of course, would bring back that part that could make them feel so empty and alone and worthless. So then the binge would have to come back and they'd be caught up in that vicious cycle for days. And as I listened to that, it reminded me of what I'd been studying in families, which are these circular sequences of interaction that escalate over time and that feed off of each other. So I began to try and apply some family therapy technique to the inner system of these bulimic kids. And but at the time, I was making the mistake that most of the field still makes, unfortunately, which is to assume these parts were the way they seemed. So the critic was some kind of internalized parental voice, and the binge was an out of control impulse. And when you think of them that way, you try to get your client to argue with the critic or to control the binge. And that was making it worse, but I didn't know what else to do. And then I had a client who, in addition to the binging and purging, cut herself on her wrists. And that was driving me crazy. And I'd heard about the Gestalt open chair technique or empty chair technique. I don't know if you know about it, but you could have a client sit in one chair and talk to an empty chair as if that part of them was in that chair. And then have them be that part talking back. And so I was doing that with these parts. And on one session, I decided I wouldn't let the client go until that cutting part had agreed not to do it to her that week. And after a couple hours of me badgering the part and her badgering the part, it finally said it wouldn't cut her. And I opened the door to the next session, and she's got a big gash down the side of her face. And I spontaneously collapsed emotionally and just came out with, I give up. I can't beat you at this. And the part said, I don't really want to beat you. And that was a turning point in the history of this work because I shifted out of that coercive part to just being curious, then why do you do this to her? And the part talked about how when she was being abused as a child, it needed to get her out of her body and it needed to contain the rage that would get her more abuse. And with that, I shifted myself more. And now I just felt kind of a appreciation for the heroic role it played in her life. It literally saved her life. And I could convey that to the part. And it broke into tears because everyone had demonized it and tried to get rid of it. Finally, somebody was listening to it. And so I tried the same thing with a bunch of other clients, some of them bulimic and some of them not, many of them addicted. And I would have that similar conversation with the addicted part. And to my amazement, these parts would all share their secret histories of how they were forced into these roles and that they really were trying to protect the client and make them get away from the feelings that the client was so scared of. And so after a while, I started to conclude that maybe I had made a big mistake. Maybe these parts aren't what they seem. And that indeed, now 40 years later, is true. And I just wrote a book called No Bad Parts because after working with parts that have done horrible, horrible things, and getting to those parts and hearing their secret histories, you learn that they're all frozen in time, often during traumas when you were young. There's the book. And yes, Daisy, is it? Yeah, thanks for holding up the book. Um, they're all frozen in time. They think you're 5 years old still, maybe. They think that they have to protect you in the way they did back then. They, from those trauma experiences, carry extreme beliefs and emotions that we call burdens. So the basic idea is that it's the natural state of the mind to be multiple, that we're born that way, to have what I call parts. Other systems call them ego states or things like that, subpersonalities. They're all valuable. There are no bad parts. We wouldn't be born with anything that wouldn't be helpful in our lives. But trauma and attachment injuries, bad parenting, force them out of their naturally valuable states into roles that can be quite damaging. And as I said, freeze them in time during the trauma so they think they still have to do it, and then burden them with these extreme beliefs and emotions that drive the way they operate, almost like a virus, like the coronavirus, that infects the part and keeps it in those extreme states. And so that's one fundamental principle of IFS. No bad parts. Everybody's got them. People with what used to be called multiple personality disorder are no different from anybody else, except that theirs got blown apart a lot more, what are called alters in MPD or DID, are the same phenomena I'm talking about that everybody has. It's just that because of the horrific abuse they suffered, theirs have these amnesic barriers between them, and they're a lot more polarized and so on, but it's the same phenomena. So this is a kind of radically different perspective on human nature, on psychotherapy, on psychopathology, very normalizing, depathologizing approach. So that's parts. And being a systems guy, I was interested in how these parts operated, not just individually, but how they related to each other as a system. And, in families, we would try to watch for patterns and see what kind of patterns that we could discern. And the patterns that leaped out and the distinctions that leaped out immediately to me with this inner system are between the parts that you might call inner children, who are young and innocent often, and before they're hurt, give us all kinds of fun qualities like playfulness and creativity and a kind of love of life and innocence, but once and they're the most sensitive parts because they are sort of like young children. But and so when you get traumatized or hurt, they're the ones that get hurt the most. And so they take on the burdens of worthlessness, for example, or terror from the trauma, or emotional pain. And once they start to carry those burdens, they have the power to overwhelm us with those feelings and pull us back into those scenes. And so we try to lock them away. We try to get away from all of that. And everybody around us tells us to just let it go. Don't look back. Just move on. And so we wind up, what in my language, exiling those parts of us just because they got hurt or terrified, locking them in inner basements or abysses, and trying our best after that to stay away from those feelings, not realizing, thinking we're just moving on from the memories, sensations, emotions, and beliefs, not realizing we're disconnecting from our most precious qualities often. So those are what I call exiles. And when you get a lot of exiles, you feel a lot more delicate. The world seems a lot more dangerous because so many things could trigger them. And if they get triggered, it's like an explosion of emotion, explosion of raw flames that can overwhelm you, can consume you, and bring you back into those terrifying scenes. So other parts are forced out of their naturally valuable states to become what we call protectors. And some of them are trying to protect these exiles by managing your life so that no one gets close enough to trigger them, or you look perfect so nobody rejects you, or you perform at a really high level. And so you get accolades to counter the worthlessness, for example. Or you take care of everybody so that everyone depends on you and likes you. Or there's a whole bunch of what we call manager roles. So parts that keep you in your head, for example, and make you think rather than feel all the time, and so on and so on. There's just lots of common manager roles. And again, these aren't the essence of these parts. They're the roles these parts were forced into to protect you. And again, many of these protectors and managers are frozen back in those traumas as well. So managers try their best, and a lot of times it succeeds and you don't get triggered and you have a decent life. But there are times that you do get triggered despite their best efforts. So these flames of emotions erupt out of your gut or wherever you've got them, and you feel like you're 5 years old in that scene again. And so there's another set of parts who are kind of on standby. And when you get triggered, they immediately go into action to deal with this emergency, to either get you higher than the flames of emotion, or douse them with some substance, or distract you until they burn themselves out. And these, what we call firefighter protectors, don't care about the consequences. They don't care about the collateral damage to your body or to your relationships. They just know if they don't do their job, you're going to die. That's what they believe often. So they'll do whatever it takes to get you away from that exiled pain. So that's the map. It's pretty simple. We've got these young exiled parts that carry all these intense burdens, like worthlessness, which is terrifying. If you feel like you're not valued, you know you're going to die. So, or this extreme terror, or extreme emotional pain, sense of abandonment, things like that. That's what exiles typically carry. And then we have managers, one set of protectors, and then firefighters. And the managers and firefighters, even though they're both trying to contain and protect the exiles, are often polarized with each other. They're fighting each other about how best to do that. So if you have an addiction, it's often began as a firefighter to get you away from an exile. But the manager who likes to be in control all the time and please everybody is furious with the firefighter for taking you out of control and pissing everybody off. And so it's attacking you for having had the addiction or doing the addictive episode. And and then that attack, that criticism from the manager, you've heard of these inner critics. Well, often they're criticizing you because you're doing things they don't like or that take you out of control. That criticism, that shaming, self-shame, goes right to the heart of the exile. And the exile feels even worse. And so the firefighter has to do even more of its job. And you get that vicious cycle going that I described with the bulimics. So again, that's the map, very simple. In describing it, it gets complicated as you try to apply it. There's one more very important piece that I haven't talked about yet, and that is that, again, as a family therapist, I was interested not just in each part individually, but in their relationships and having them change relationships. And so I might have my client try to get to know and maybe even get along better with, let's say, their critic. And so I'm setting up that dialogue, and initially in the open chair, but one client said, I don't really have to hop around in these chairs. I can just sit here and do it. So since then, most everybody just sits there and does it. And I'm saying, okay. And this is after I got hip to the fact that these parts aren't what they seem and they deserve to be listened to. So I'm trying to get my client to listen to the critic rather than argue with it. And it's going okay. But suddenly my client gets furious with the critic. And it reminds me of family sessions where I'm having two people talk to each other. One of them gets extreme with the other. We were taught to look around the room and see if there isn't somebody, a third party, cueing the one who's upset that he disagrees with the other one and triangulating that way. And we were taught to get that third person to move out of the line of vision of the one who's being triggered to try and create a better boundary around the other two. And you found in family therapy that really works, that actually helps. So I'd say, could you find the one who's just jumped in, who's so angry at the critic, and could you get it to just chill, just relax, step back, just like I would do in a family session? And to my amazement, the client said, okay, it did. And now how do you feel toward this critic? It would be an entirely different answer. Seconds earlier, they hated it, and now they're curious about it. They're calm relative to it. They have confidence where they were cowed by it before. Even compassion for it. Out of the blue. It was like this whole different person would come popping out. And when I would try it with other clients and get a couple parts to step back, it's like the same person came out of them with a lot of those same qualities that I just mentioned. And so when I would ask client, and when that person showed up, the conversation with the critic or whatever part we were working with would go well. And we could actually help these parts share their stories of how they got into these roles. And down the road, I learned how to get them out of those roles and get them out of where they were stuck in the past and help them unburden these extreme beliefs and emotions. And then amazingly, like a curse has been lifted, they would transform into their naturally valuable states. So that's a lot of what IFS is about, is transformation of these parts back into who they're designed to be. It's sort of like, we learned as family therapists, you can't take an acting out kid out of his family context and say, just cut it out. You have to learn about the family dynamics that are forcing that kid into that role and change those dynamics and free him from that role. And when he's liberated from that role, he'll be who he's really supposed to be. He doesn't have to be in this role of the scapegoat or the acting out guy. It's the same thing with this inner system. So when I would ask clients, what part of you is that has all these great qualities like calm and confidence and curiosity and compassion? they'd say, that's not a part like these others. That's me. That's myself. So I came to call that the self with a capital S. And now, 40 years later, thousands of clients later, thousands of people using this all over the world, we can safely say that that self is in everybody, is just beneath the surface of these parts, such that when they do open space, it pops out spontaneously, can't be damaged, and knows how to heal. When it's accessed, will respond to not only parts, but people in a healing way. And that's a big deal. That's a big game changer, to know that that's in everybody, to know that that's who you are really. And that the parts you identify with are just burdened parts stuck in dark places. So that's the model. And like I said, the actual work involves client comes in, tells us a problem. I'll ask about the emotions and thoughts the client has around the problem. As they're telling me that, I'll say, oh, okay, so one part of you says this to you inside, and then another part makes you feel this way, and then this other part takes over and makes you act in a way that you don't like. Is that right? And because everybody uses that word in daily parlance, part, people don't say, what are you talking about? They say, yeah, that's right. Yeah, there is a part of me that does this, and then this other part does that. So I'll have that conversation for a while, and then I'll ask, is there one of those parts you'd like to maybe change or get to know at least? And client picks one. And if at that point they pick what I think might be an exile, I'll say, we'll get to that. But first I want to work with the parts that don't want us anywhere near that. So we don't go to exiles first. We go to protectors first to get permission often to go to exiles. But I learned the hard way, the mistake of going to exiles first, because protectors will backlash. They don't like it. They feel violated. They spent 20 years keeping people away from those vulnerable parts, and here you come in and throw open the door and let them out. So we generally go to protectors first. We go to protectors not expecting them to change, actually. We go to protectors to honor them for their service, like you might the military, to learn about what they're protecting and honor them for protecting it, and then try to get permission to go to the exiles that they protect. And again, knowing often that the protector won't change, it can't change, it believes, until what it protects has been healed and the system feels less vulnerable. And again, that's a takeaway from family therapy. Structural family therapy, the kid won't change or the parent won't change until the structure of the system has changed and that person is freed up from their role. It's the same with this internal system. So we go to protectors, negotiate permission, which involves, they often have real intense fear about opening the door to the exiles. So we've learned how to address all their fears, to get permission. We get permission, we go to an exile, which again often looks like a child to the client. We get them in self relative to it. And the process of that is, whenever a client sees a part, the first question I'll ask is, how do you feel toward it? And in answering that question, I'm learning how much of self is present versus other parts. So if they don't like it, that wouldn't be self. So let's get that one to step back. Or if they're afraid of it, that wouldn't be self. Let's get that to step back until the answer is one of those C words. I'm curious about it. I feel calm relative to it. I feel sorry for it. I feel compassion for it. And there's 4 other C words that characterize self, which include, I see it clearly now. It's not a monster. It's just a teenager. Clarity. So creativity. I feel like I can be creative in how I relate to it. Connectedness. I feel connected to it, or I want to connect to it. and then uh, courage. I'm not afraid to go to it. I can get close to it. So those are what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. And I'll review them again. So calm, curiosity, confidence, compassion, courage, creativity, clarity, and connectedness. And those 8 C's have held up all these 40 years as the qualities. There are others, but they don't begin with the letter C, so I didn't include them. And also, these are the most relevant to the healing process. So we do that until, in response to that question, how do you feel toward the part, I get one of those C words. And then I know it's safe to begin the process of having the client interact with it. And often start with curiosity. So ask the part what it wants you to know about itself. Non-threatening question. And then, if it's a protector, what's it afraid would happen if it didn't do this job? And in answering that, you're learning about how it's trying to protect the system. And with that question and the answer, we start to negotiate. So if we could, like, let's say the protector says, if I didn't make you feel like shit all the time, you might take a lot of risks and then you get hurt, which is a common answer from one of these critics. So I might say, okay, that makes sense. But if we could heal the parts that would get hurt if you took a risk, so the risk wasn't as risky, would you need to be so hard on her? No, but I don't think you can do that. Would you give us permission to try to do that? Just to see. And we can do it without that little girl overwhelming her and taking over. And we can, I promise you, we won't be judging you as we get close to her. And these are some of the common fears these protectors have. So I'm just reassuring that we can do it all. And we're not going to go to her without your permission. If you really don't want us to, we're not going to do it. You're the boss. So it's like that. And then another really important question for these protectors often is, how old do you think the client is? Using the client's name. How old do you think she is? You'd be amazed at how often the answer is single digits, even when these clients are adults or even, quite old. These parts literally think you're still a kid. So even just updating them about how old you are and how much you can handle now that you couldn't handle then is shocking to some of these parts and allows for more permission to do what we want to do. So let's say we get permission, focus on that feeling of shame and worthlessness and find it in your body and around your body. So, this is the Embody lab. So focusing on the body and noticing where these parts seem to operate is a big part of the work, and it serves as an anchor point. So you direct the questions to that place in the body, you get the answers from that place in the body. So, okay. So you find this feeling of worthlessness in your gut. Okay. And how do you feel toward that part? Oh, you're interested in why it feels so bad. Okay. So let it know that and just see what this part wants you to know about its worthlessness. And we wait, and don't think of the answer, just wait and see what comes from your gut. And we wait, and the client starts to often see herself spontaneously as a little girl and see herself in a scene where she got that feeling. And how now do you feel toward that girl? Well, I feel sorry for her. Okay, and so ultimately, we do what we call the witnessing, where the little girl shows what happened and how bad it made her feel. And often that's very intense. The client is crying, and then when the exile feels fully witnessed, I'd like you now to go into that scene and be with her in the way she needed somebody at the time. And clients will say, okay, I'm there. How are you being with her? Well, I'm standing next to her, and helping her see that I'm there, she's not alone now, and I'm telling the mother to never do that again. And, and we'll do whatever the little girl wants back there. And then when she's ready, take her out of that scene to a safe, comfortable place, often to the present, sometimes to a fantasy place. And once she trusts that she never has to go back there, ask if she's ready to unload these burdens she carries, the worthlessness or any other beliefs about the world or about herself. And often, I'd say always, you can ask the little girl where she carries that in her body or on her body, and they'll tell you. And what does she want to give all that up to? And we offer a menu of the elements: light, water, fire, wind, earth, anything else. And then we have her out of her body. And amazingly, it's like a curse has been lifted, and now she feels much lighter and she wants to play. And then we bring all the protectors in to see they don't have to protect her anymore. And now what would they like to do instead? And do they want to unburden too? And then it's on to the next thing. So that's the practice. Let me pause here and see if there are any questions or reactions.